Hello and welcome to this presentation on Internet language, Brexit, politics and social media. So, when we look to the agenda, we have to look at the additional bullet points. Who am I? Context, audience, research and methodology, politics, and of course, a conclusion. Well, my name is Oliver Tomlinson, and within this presentation, I will convey information I have found as the basis of my methodology through social media and the political discourses that have surrounded Brexit and that will be expanded upon and developed through my literature review. I will use Twitter as examples of these, as the social media network has been at the centre and continues to be a hub of fierce public debate through language and interaction. It is also a place in which politicians, journalists and prominent social actors announce and debate the wider political discourses that sometimes elude other social media giants. The audience will benefit from this, as it will allow them to expand upon the different ideas put forward by social communicators, whilst also giving them a greater example of how and why Twitter is formed to adapt and debate through this, whilst also examining its function and usage to an audience that can identify the political persuasions and how these have a greater and wider societal impact outside of the social media network. It's giving the audience a heightened understanding of the construct within political debate through one of our most tumultuous times through the electoral system and the symbiotic relationship with politics and culture that goes so through with social media. This brings us to the proposal and question I am asking. How has Brexit informed and affected the political discourse on social media, particularly Twitter? Social media. Through social media and indeed Twitter, we can see how the faster, sharper, 140 characters, well, now 240, can create a virile and reactionary atmosphere. It can also be difficult to place the interaction within time, as the ways in which we communicate through it are vastly different to the ways in which we would engage in everyday conversation. Within the quote from Strombach and Clausis, we point out how people leverage and harness the power of Twitter through most of the political to endorse, establish and maintain relationships through key public institutions. I thought this was necessary to quote within a slide on social media, as it is important to note this usage if you want to expand upon our argument and effect on political persuasion. I have also used the tweet of former EU President Donald Tusk as an example because it again relies upon that notion of sparking debate and conversation, expanding upon the arguments under scrutiny, debating the for and against model within framing and recognising the social actors within the sphere. In the next two slides, I have created a collage of different tweets conveying opinions and debate, as well as showcasing headlines as well. I have done this to give context to the subject, displaying use of language and opposing views. I also felt this was an engaging and interesting way of addressing these. It also kind of shows this kind of atmosphere of instant opinion, how many people have different opinions, whether funny, political, but it has this kind of overwhelming sense of instancy. Everyone has an opinion, everyone wants to say something, everyone is using this type of language, Ramonas, Brexiteers, Project Fear. There's all this kind of atmosphere going on during and after the election, which I thought was interesting to note and use, and also it can just be used as a PowerPoint point. I've also obviously used headlines as well. It gives context within the national press because it informs and expands upon the social media today, and most importantly its language. Like I said in the previous slide, all this idea of sort of Ramonas, Brexiteers, Project Fear, this is all kind of then taken from social media and also put into the media as well. And that I thought that was an interesting thing because it's like social media is informing what then the political viewpoint that is then espoused by different publications, different publications, tabloids, broadsheet papers, and I thought that's interesting because it shows how important social media is to this, and Twitter in particular, because a lot of these things have been used and adapted and communicated through the social media platform. So I just thought these two slides were interesting to have because it gives us the context and also allows us to look at the language side of things as well as we develop our argument and go through this. Now we move on to the research methodology, and obviously, of course, we're going to be using journals, articles, Twitter, academic books. These are the types of things I've been looking at. I also use this quote from Grok Cherokopsy and Mosetic, because I thought this was interesting to have in a research methodology slide. It talks about there are three main modalities in which users on Twitter interact. The user follows posts of other users, the user responds to other users' retweets by mentioning them or replying to them, and the user forwards interesting tweets by retweeting them. Based on these three types of interactions, one can define three measures of influence of a Twitter user. In degree influencer, the number of followers indicating the size of his or his audience. Mention influence, the number of mentions of the user indicating his ability to engage others in conversation. And retweet influence, the number of retweets indicating the ability of the user to write content of interest to be forwarded to others. I thought this was interesting to use because this shows you how then the communication going forward is based. If you're basing yourself off user response, if you're on a platform where you have a high number of followers, it's very different in the way in which people will approach you, in the interactions you have, because it really depends on the influence the individual has and the power that then is kind of split between the person and the page as well. So I thought that was interesting to denote because I felt like it's really important to what we are examining here in terms of the way people communicate within this type of social media language, because a lot of it is informed by these things such as retweeting, followers. How much influence you have basically is an important part of the engagement within this, and I thought that was an interesting and valid point to make in the argument we are espousing. Now I move on to 3 slides of examples that I've taken from different readings of different things on social media, politics and Brexit, obviously. And this first one's basically about how it highlights and to showcase how disparate people are within their political leanings, but it's not just highlighting that, it's also highlighting how involved people have been with Brexit and how involved they've been in the past year just in politics in general. So at first we've got the strike or industrial action. Obviously it's very low in the past year because that is based more in Britain particularly in a kind of 70s 80s context, and appears in the media. That rapidly increases in the past year, which shows us that we're in a media age as well. So that shows us how time has changed as well. Boycotting products, that's kind of more in the distant past, but is still relevant to the past year as well within Twitter. And then we move on to altered political meeting. This is where this sort of expands as well, which is interesting and kind of shows us where we are going as well. And then demonstrations, that's kind of split because people can kind of demonstrate on social media now. So that's the difference, I suppose. But people don't really recognise demonstrating on social media as opposed to doing it publicly. And then contact to public politician, that's rapidly increased in the past year, which shows us that within Twitter we can communicate with political officials. Do you know what I mean? We can communicate, and that shows how in the past year that is rapidly increased. And then signed a petition, this shows an increase as well. So it just basically shows us the different sort of roles within society people play, and also how that relates to the political, but also how these things that have expanded in the past year are all kind of things that could be expanded upon within social media, which I thought was interesting to use. Joe appeared in media, demonstrations, signed a petition, particularly contacting a politician, because you can do that so much more easily through social media now. And I thought that was interesting to know in our language and also our kind of construction of that interaction and the way in which we go forward. I also noted hashtags as well, because I thought that was important. It's not just outside, and I thought that was important because they also play a key role in communication aspect. People putting hashtags all the time, and then they can go through all the latest tweets. If you put hashtag Brexit, you can see so many different opinions, so many different thoughts, so many different feelings, so many different announcements. So that's interesting to have that, because then it's different from just engaging in a conversation. You are actively searching for what's mentioned, how it's mentioned, who's mentioning it, where they're mentioning it. So I thought that was interesting to note as well. And it also just gives us some interesting ideas about how many mentions, how many London, EU, Today, Brexit, UK, I just thought it was interesting to note that because it kind of shows us how people are going outside of that communicative aspect as well, because they're actually actively searching for this debate as well as talking about it. So I thought that was interesting to sort of denote as well. Also, now we've got here the differing opinions on Twitter for the European Union. Having percentages lead us, it shows us how the language is used as well, kind of, because it kind of having see it from an outside perspective, the negative, the positive, and people even having opinions on it is interesting because it kind of shows us the kind of wider societal impact, but also it shows us the power of social media as well, because it kind of shows us, these many people are discussing it, these countries are discussing it, the EU obviously is discussing it, but it kind of just, and it gives us, it's good to have this negative and positive as well, because then we can sort of see where we are on the sort of playing field in terms of how that's then co-opted by the leaders, figures, different social actors and stuff like that. So I thought that was interesting to note as well. Now we move on to politics. I feel like we've already sort of mentioned class in the kind of, when we broke down how many people have spoken in the past year. I feel like that has a kind of class thing to it, because you've got all the different sort of demonstrations, and I feel like people see that as more of a kind of something you do publicly. Obviously, we've got the for and against. We had that with the Donald Tusk tweet. That sparked a lot of debate and interest, and a lot of people agreed with him, a lot of people disagreed, but it kick-started a kind of frenzy over this, over deals and what was happening, and then that led to further discussion about Brexit, and obviously we spoke about political storm, because that can be related to that as well, and social actors. How we interact ourselves. We are social actors. And also, I've got this quote from Chen talking about, whilst classic institutionalists would explain electoral systems and constitutional design as determining political behaviour by elites, constructivists see these formal political behaviours more likely to be responsive to cultural norms and values that are plastic. I've obviously used this quote again because I feel like it's really important, this idea of incorporating this, in embedding and sort of intertwining this relationship of culture and politics. Twitter is a form of culture, and it discusses many other things outside of politics and Brexit, but it informs the political standard as well, because you need that culture in order to have opinion and a debate, but also it just spreads worldwide, and that's how that is what social media is now. That is what Twitter is now. It's a cultural melting pot of different opinions, different ideas, different language, different ways in which we can communicate. And I thought that was an interesting thing to note, because I think it is important to our argument about affect and language, and how this then moves forward, because at the same time, as well as the Brexit debate, social media is expanding itself as well. It's not just Brexit, it's moving on within societal culture and how things are changing anyway. It's been exacerbated and moved forward by that, but these things were happening already, but it just shows how the atmosphere brings things to a more finite sort of explosion of different forms. So now we come to the conclusion. Obviously, we've spoken about different people. We've obviously used the examples and used opinions. We've talked about the function and how influence and power have a really interesting dynamic within the structure of how you can use Twitter. We've talked about retweeting. We've talked about reaction with the headlines and the tweets, and how these headlines are then informed by these tweets, and how people use, humour, political opinion, debate. We talked about cross socio-economic with that breakdown of how people have worked within, how people have shown their political sort of espouses through their different actions they've taken, and how that's progressed and changed and developed. And also, what this says? Well, this says that we're in a society where debate, opinion have played out instantaneously, and it also shows us how people are interested, how people are progressing within this, and how people are moving forward within this, and how it's shaping the ways in which we will go forward expressing these opinions. And obviously I will expand further within my literature review, as I feel like that's the argument I'm going to take, and that is how I've gathered the research, I've gathered what I want to look at, I've gathered how this is going to help me inform that, and now I'm going to move forward in expanding upon that and seeing where that goes, and seeing how it seems and how it feels. Thank you for watching and listening to this presentation. I hope it has been informative, and I hope I have expressed my opinions, the research, and how this will inform everything I will do going forward.